wide-site TV.
What role do you see floating wind playing in the energy transition?
I think the story around floating wind is absolutely critical, but we're just at the beginning. So I don't think most people realize just how critical a role it's going to have. All the paths to net zero are fantastic, but right now, they're not happening fast enough. So in reality, DNV's energy transition outlook basically highlights that the carbon budgets for 1.5 degrees will be gone by 2029, for 2 degrees will be gone by 2053, and at the turn of the century, we'll be at 2.3 degrees. So we've had wonderful momentum in ambitious net zero statements from companies and governments, but clearly they're not getting us there fast enough. So the clear area, electrification has to be the main game in town. Solar and wind are the two main routes to make that happen. And in terms of wind, it's offshore wind, but we're limited. We're limited by space and all the issues around it. So the obvious place to go is further out into floating wind. And maybe, Steph, you could share a bit more details onto the sort of how and why of floating wind.
Yeah, I mean, according to our ETO, we think that floating wind is only going to account for about 2% of the energy mix by 2050, which is actually a surprisingly small number, despite how much we talk about it. Because I feel like 70% of my work right now is talking about floating wind. And it's a bit disappointing that we only think 2% is what it's going to be. And the good news, I think, is that the prospect of floating wind, it opens up at least 4 times as much ocean space as we have with bottom fixed. So there's a lot of potential out there, despite, from our modeling, us saying that actually the number is only going to be 2%. We think it could be much more based on the potential. And having that increased amount of ocean space, it gives us a lot more flexibility in site selection of floating wind farms. So you don't have these constraints about, oh, well, it needs to be so shallow. Ooh, the wind isn't really good there, or oh, there's social and environmental impacts. No, none, all of those barriers are sort of removed when you go into deeper waters. Well, in most cases. So it really kind of opens up a lot of potential. And we think actually, in the next 10 to 15 years, one of the benefits is that the cost of floating wind is going to drop significantly, mainly due to the progress that we're making in Europe. So it's not really going to come down to parity with bottom fix, but it'll be pretty darn close, and that is mostly going to be driven by scale.
So Stephanie, you're right. That is a really small figure, 2%. I was surprised when you said that. What are the blockers that we need to address to reach commercial deployment to even get to that 2% figure and maybe more?
I think, like Harry was saying earlier, a lot of it is policy and regulation. It's one of the key inhibitors for the deployment of floating wind. We've found that even here in the UK, the targets for floating wind, it sounds great, a gigawatt, but actually, we think it's too low to catalyze things like having a sufficient supply chain to support the industry. And in order to reap the benefits of scale, which is what we're saying floating wind can provide, um, that scale will inherently drive down costs, and we can't really get that scale unless we have the targets to support it.
Yeah, in terms of, if I just take a step back, as Stephanie has mentioned, there's an element of the supply chain, and as whether it's Biden in the US with 30, I think he's committed to 35 gigawatts offshore. In the UK, we're committed to 40. If you took out in Asia Pac, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, which I just happen to know off the top of my head, is about 80 plus gigawatts. There's a real danger as we ramp up these offshore wind and floating sectors. You're all going to start competing for the same resources, both in terms of hardware and in terms of talent. So really sufficiently ramping up this supply chain is a really fundamental part. Yes, I think the policies are needed. It's taking too long, and Stephanie's described that. I think there is one element, I would say, certainly if you looked at the UK, there's been a very positive impact of the government's role. It's enabled us to get to where we are with these open auctions. It's enabled a kind of between the rocks and the CFDs. the renewable obligation certificates and the contract for differences, it's enabled us to go from a kind of smaller industry to, building out 10 gigawatts and having it at scale. So governments have done more, but a bit like the energy transition itself, you can't just sit back and give yourself a pat on the back for what you have done. You've got to double up, triple up, and quadruple up everything you're doing if we're going to have a chance of really meeting. So it's not a question that they're blockers, but it's just we all need to do more. And that's before we even get into the other challenges to do with moving the electricity. Once you've generated electricity, you've got to move it through transmission and distribution. And there's a lot of stuff to do with the end user as well. And then finally, as you see this whole scaling up, which I have a feeling we'll explore a little bit more soon, is you start to look at the whole infrastructure. You're moving to, yes, we've got some fantastic companies and support to deliver the expansion of offshore wind and floating, but if you're going to quadruple it, you're going to need a whole lot more of offshore construction capability and the ability to de-risk projects.
Let's talk about cross-sector pollinisation. Harry, to what extent will the growth of wind be accelerated by the involvement of the traditional oil and gas majors? They have a lot of investment, they have a lot of experience they can bring to this.
Undoubtedly, it will help, but I would just caveat it with there is an existing industry for offshore wind that has done a great job of taking it from where it was to getting it to where it is. But my reference to the energy transition and doing more is it's a question of all hands on deck. Yeah, DNV is actually a 150-year-old shipping company as well. So the all hands on deck is quite a useful expression. So what I think it does is it brings more capital, it brings more knowledge, and it brings other players into the market. So if we're going to quadruple something, you need more, to be able to deliver it. So the oil and gas industry is used to working offshore. It's used to scale. It's used to ramping up. It's used to supply chain challenges. It's used to de-risking large offshore projects. So from that aspect, I think it brings a lot to the table. But Steph, I don't know if you want to add, there is already an existing industry that does a pretty good job as well.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think Harry hit the nail on the head. It all kind of has to do with risk reduction. Uh, Having the IOCs sort of join the industry with floating wind, they can bring an enormous amount to risk reduction. And I think in order to get the scale that we need to make the most out of floating wind, you need to reduce the risks around, the experience of the developers, which the IOCs very clearly have experience with, floater technology and cabling. I think I could go on and on, but I think that the whole idea is that IOCs will really be able to help with one of the major inhibitors to floating wind, which is risk reduction.
That's really interesting. And Harry, you said, we need more. I was going to say, what do you need more of? And then Stephanie kind of answered that by saying we need more risk reduction. What
Yeah.
risk? What risk are you thinking of particularly? A financial risk, or safety risk, or just performance, asset integrity? What do you mean by risk?
I think there's two different sides to that. One is the scale brings you the cost reduction. You have to have cost reduction if we're going to scale, just the same way that we went from kind of land-based wind to kind of offshore wind and the fixed bottom. So as you move out, so the challenges of cost and scale become really important. And maybe I'll ask at this point, maybe Steph, you want to talk a little bit about cost reduction, because that's an area I know you've looked at.
Yeah. Yeah, the exciting thing that our ETO is saying is that the cost reduction in the next 10 to 15 years for floating wind is going to come down so much, and mainly because of Europe, because we have an existing supply chain for bottom fixed. We have a lot of the major OEMs sitting in Europe, and we think there's going to be a lot of investment from countries in Europe in this industry and in building up and de-risking the technology and the projects and providing design and standardization of both components and of the projects and of the processes. And so really it's going to be Europe that sort of drives that cost reduction in the next 10 years. And I have a feeling that we're probably going to be talking about, where is actually going to floating wind be the next big thing. But Europe is going to play a major role in cost reductions in the next 15 years.
So we alluded to storage earlier. So let's talk about that now. So Harry, in the past, I've heard you describe storage as an enabler of variable supply. Can you talk to me a bit about what the immediate priorities are in that area, and how do you see that evolving in the next few years? I'm thinking more short to medium term here, rather
Sure.
than
In many ways, the role of storage is an immediate thing. You only have to look at what's happening in the UK right now. When you have variable supply and variable demand, managing to kind of balance the supply and demand side is an incredible challenge. And I'd actually like to bring Stephanie back in again, because we've been doing a lot of work, and to some degree, the limitations of energy storage have been a blocker. But I think it's inevitable that when you see a blocker, it's an opportunity, because you've got to be able to solve it. And certainly Stephanie and her team have been spending a lot of time in this energy storage space from an electron point of view, because there's still a molecule for storage as well. But I'd like to leave that to one side. But maybe Stephanie, you can talk some more about the specifics in the energy storage space and what's been going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So not long ago, if we kind of maybe just focus on quickly on the UK, there was, an increasing penetration of renewables in the system. And I guess we've seen this for probably the last 10 or 15 years now. But in the last 5 or so, it began, it was so high that the electricity system was having, stability challenges. And so to counteract this, energy storage kind of came in and was providing ancillary services. Mostly for frequency response, and that helped national grid in balancing the supply and demand, and because energy storage played this critical role, that has kind of set, I think, the technology up, at least in the UK, for kind of further developments. I think in terms of immediate priorities, one of the challenges in the UK is that there's no regulatory and licensing framework for energy storage in the UK, and it's kind of a known challenge, and we know that efforts are being made to try and clarify this. But I think until they are, that's one of the things that can keep it from kind of rising to its full potential. Another element is that there's been like a surge in energy storage deployments, and because of that, what we've seen is there's actually a lack of skills and resourcing to support kind of the industry itself. So because it's been this kind of incredibly quick growing industry, we haven't been able to keep up with it. So that's a challenge, I think, for us, especially in the UK. And although not specific to the UK market, there's also kind of a lack of clarity around standards and compliance issues around energy storage. As you probably know, there was a battery facility in Liverpool in 2020 that had a really bad fire event, and so there's a lot more focus being put on standardization and safety issues around batteries.
here's a rather abstract question. What don't we know enough about?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. What went actually, the surprising thing, DNV does a lot of kind of broader risk analyses and studies of the market. And if I was speaking honestly, humbly, technology is not the barrier. Technology is not the barrier to the energy transition. Just excuse me. The real challenge is you are in an energy system. Yeah, you're an energy system, and we know that energy system, and we also know the destination of the energy system you want to get to. Yeah, and that is a net zero energy system, and where you are today. So our energy transition outlook report showed that we were in a 20% non-fossil fuel in 1990, 8% fossil fuels, and our current forecast says at least we've improved that picture to 54% non-fossil fuels and 46% fossil fuels. And then what we're saying is that's not enough. That's not good enough for net zero, but at least it's an improvement. So I think we actually know enough. The truth is, I think we know enough. The challenge is to make all of this happen in what is a relatively complex energy system. And you see it just today again in the UK. If you're not careful, if you move away from things too fast, and you build up, and you can't build up your new renewable sources fast enough, you get left with a gap. And that gap could easily result in very short-term shocks to the market. Yeah. And that's actually what you're seeing now. So the real challenge is, how do you do the energy transition while always balancing supply and demand? So I don't think it's a question of what we don't know. It's a question of making everything happen at the same time as migrating the energy system. And I think, although my words may make it sound really simple, I think that's an incredibly challenging thing to do at a global and country level.
I think that what Harry said is, I mean, he pretty much summed it up. I think, we have talked a lot about the UK here in this context, and I think maybe what we don't know is how specifically we're going to get to that end goal. We have ideas, but we need to kind of explore all the different paths to it. And I don't think there's going to be one path. I think there's going to be many that we need to go down to make sure that they're going to hold water.
Let's talk about the kind of global piece now. Tell me, where are the regional hotspots you're looking at right now? What are the markets that are exciting you?
Yeah, so I think for floating wind, kind of unsurprisingly, uh, the major growth is going to be in Europe, in Asia Pacific, and then also in the US. Um, as I mentioned before, Europe is going to play a major role in the cost reductions out for the next 10 to 15 years or so. But once we've established scale, once we have scale of deployment of floating wind, I can assure you that the installed capacity is just going to explode in Asia and the US, and will kind of far surpass our installed capacities in Europe. So we think that um, countries in APAC will be number one. So kind of that region is going to be number one for installed capacity, and US won't be far behind them.
Energy. Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. Widesight TV.